As it's January, I thought we should do the whole Janus thing for sustainability, taking the opportunity to look backwards at 2023 and then forward to the year ahead. And who better to help me than James Murray, editor of Business Green, who's one of the shrewdest observers of all things business and sustainability around. So thanks for joining me, James.
No, thanks, Gareth. Thanks for having me.
I'm sure most listeners will be familiar with Business Green, but just in case, could you briefly summarize what you guys do?
Yeah, I suppose we kind of do what it says on the tin. We're a news and information website, primarily news, but we do lots of analysis and in-depth features as well for the green economy, for green businesses, and the wider kind of progressive green economy community.
Brilliant, thanks. James and I have been pondering a series of questions, but we haven't seen each other's answers just yet. So it'll be interesting to find out where we agree and disagree on these questions. So, James, let's start by looking back at 2023. What were your top three pivotal events of the year?
Yeah, so I'm not sure if there's a bit of recency bias going on here because they're all towards the tail end of the year, partly because we cover so much stuff, it's hard to remember everything that went on. But I mean, I would certainly start with the outcome from COP28 and the UAE consensus. I'm absolutely not one of these people who think the whole thing is a sideshow and an irrelevance. I mean, I think there's real significance and value in all the world's governments coming together to reach compromise agreements on climate action, even if they are by definition inadequate. And I do think the commitments that came out of the Dubai summit were really significant. Obviously, the headline commitment that all countries agreed to transition away from fossil fuels in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement. I think that was a really, really big signal to markets worldwide that fossil fuel investments are riskier than ever before and green investments are more attractive than ever before. And then you add in some of the other stuff that they delivered there, like more funding for loss and damage and various other kind of sectoral targets for renewable energy and energy efficiency and the like. And it was, you have to caveat it and say it was not big enough in any way, shape, or form, and we're still on track for whatever it is, 2.5, 3 degrees of warming this century. But that was real progress and significant progress, and I think most businesses will recognize it as such. So I think that for me is probably the first big headline one.
Right. Yeah. Well, I had that one as well as my number one. I suppose I would temper it a little bit with the shock I got that that the COP process took that long to get to the nub of the problem, which is fossil fuels, and whether it was wishful thinking or just sort of tiptoeing around the elephant in the room. But it did seem, I'm glad we got there, but it seems quite incredible we took that long to get there.
Yeah, it absolutely does. But then I also think, there is a chunk of countries that clearly don't believe in the need to decarbonize this quickly and are clearly completely wedded to a fossil fuel economy model. And the fact that they felt such pressure that they kind of had to sign off on these words that basically mean their previous economic development model is toast, that, if these words are manifest, then they are in a huge amount of trouble. I think, again, that is a really significant sign that things are shifting, and stuff that wouldn't have been imaginable 2 or 3 years ago is now, a part of an international accord. And these things do matter because they do send signals to investors. They do send signals to insurance companies and risk managers. They do send signals to big corporates and companies, and they do send signals to governments around the world. So I completely agree. All the caveats apply, but it did feel like a significant moment, and I think people were right to celebrate it, albeit for only a short period.
Okay, what's number two on your list then?
So number two was going back to, going from that global perspective to a much more domestic point of view and a lot of these are policy focused, because I do think so much of the net zero transition and sustainable business is still either led by or shaped by policy to a large degree. So I do think Rishi Sunak's kind of decision to make a kind of very visible attack on net zero policies was another big turning point, big story of this year. Again, I think, it was overspun a little bit. The actual changes in the policies weren't significant, but I do think the shift in the rhetoric from number 10, the growing influence of parts of the Conservative Party that have never taken this agenda seriously, is a worrying development, and will definitely have more impact going into this year in an election year.
Yeah.
And I think you only have to see the kind of chorus of disapproval from business groups, not just NGOs. This wasn't just campaign that was saying that this is a retrograde step. This was big businesses, big investors saying, look, we can't invest if we're just getting such mixed signals. And we do need a bit more clarity and leadership from government. And yeah, it's hard to look past that as a negative, but very significant story from this year.
Yeah. I don't actually have that one in my top three, so I'll if we move on to your third one, then
My,
I'll come in my.
I was a bit torn on this one. So I put as my third one. Did emissions peak last year?
Yeah.
There's analysis that suggests, certainly from the energy system, maybe globally as a whole, emissions might have peaked last year. And if they didn't, if they didn't peak last year, they're probably going to peak this coming year. And I just think at that big global level, the structural shift that we're seeing with clean energy massively surpassing dirty energy in terms of new capacity coming online, the energy efficiency gains that are being made in industrialized economies, the pace of the shift actually in China as well, which again doesn't really get appreciated. I mean, that's the big economy that really determines the weather for these things, both figuratively and literally. The huge shifts going on there, and even as they're building more coal capacity, there's a growing sense that that capacity is going to be used a lot less than was previously projected. So I do think the fact that we are at, or maybe even past, the peak in global emissions will be, that if that is the case, that will be a kind of world historic moment that we've just lived through, a kind of almost a civilizational level.
Yeah.
So I think that could be the one. Obviously depends on whether or not it happened or not, but we'll
Yeah.
find out when the data comes through in the coming months.
Yeah. And then probably a couple of years to see what happens after the peak, whether it's just a slight leveling off. But yes, and when you're speaking there, going back to some of the other things you were talking about, again, if global emissions do peak, it gets us away from that narrative that the UK is on some sort of suicidal path to net zero, while the rest of the world looks on and laughs. If global emissions peak, then it undercuts that narrative.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a slightly Panglossian view that there's certain people that I really respect do subscribe to that say, actually, once we do peak, it will be quite a sharp drop off. That you're going to see this S-curve adoption of clean technologies that will destroy fossil fuel demand so much quicker than is projected. And we're starting to see that in certain electric vehicle markets. I mean, like the scale of the electric vehicle adoption rates in China in particular, which again is the big market that can shift the dial very quickly, in parts of the US, in parts of Europe. I mean, it feels optimistic to me. I think there's definitely reasons to treat these projections with a pinch of salt, but there are also, as I say, credible outfits that say this stuff's going to deploy so quickly now that it's proven and now it's more cost competitive that we could start to see emissions fall really quickly. And you're right, that from a kind of political economy perspective, that does transform everything, because you start to normalize it. You completely sort of destroy these arguments that the green net zero route forward is a route that will result in poverty and insecurity, and you actually start to show that no, actually this is just a normal development path now. It could be, and I keep saying could, but it really could be transformational and hugely positive, and hold out the hopes that by the mid-2030s we are maybe not quite onto a 2-degree compatible decarbonisation path, but moving towards it much more quickly than we previously thought possible.
Yeah. My two actually relate a little bit to that, but are more narrow in focus. The second one was a piece of legislation, EU legislation, that almost passed me by, which was the Carbon Boundary Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM. And I think this could be transformational and help drive that peak that you're talking about. And it's mainly been presented as a way of stopping carbon leakage. In other words, high carbon industry simply moving overseas to where they may be less regulated, but not cutting the emissions overall, because it means that industries in those countries are going to have to reduce their carbon intensity in order to compete. globally. The EU have introduced this autumn. It's not starting to bite yet. It ratchets up. The UK is considering it. The US is mulling on doing the same. So if all the big sort of consumption countries start, putting this barrier, basically a carbon tax on the border, I think that could make a real difference and really start to drive decarbonization down these global supply chains. And again, it gets away from that idea that we just lose industry to other nations.
Yeah, you've preempted one of my answers for later. Actually, I was going to highlight the CBAM as well. I mean, I couldn't agree more. I think it's a absolutely massively important lever, and if the EU and the UK and others hold their nerve, the impact could be really profound. You could almost by default start to get a global carbon price in place, which
Yeah.
is obviously for many economists who work in this space has been the kind of holy grail that would arguably have a bigger impact on decarbonisation than
Yeah.
anything else. So I think it's really significant. I mean, politically, it's going to still be very challenging. There's going to be lots of kind of trade disputes and accusations of protectionism bumping around once these import tariffs actually get imposed. But if it's done well, it really could be transformational. I couldn't agree more.
The other thing I had, which is perhaps a little bit more personal, living in the northeast of England, where two of these events happened, is the contrasting fortunes of electric vehicle battery gigafactories. Because we had all the hype over British Volt, which promptly collapsed, and the empty site that was cleared still has big posters up, is only about 13 miles north of where I'm sat at the minute. And then the contrast between that and what Nissan have built in collaboration with I think it's a Chinese battery manufacturer, right next to their plant in Washington. And I was actually asked to join a small sort of collaboration to pitch to British or services to British Bolt, and I wouldn't touch it. I couldn't see what they had to sell, whereas the Nissan project had both a product and customer to buy it,
Mm.
buy that product. And we talk a lot about green business and creating green jobs, but a little mantra of mine is it still has to make business sense. So you have to make it work. And I've seen too many projects come in on a wave of hype and then disappear again. And I'm hoping the JLR one in Somerset as well is similar. It's being done in collaboration with a major manufacturer, so they have the customer base there. So I think it's a big lesson for green businesses, and particularly those who are looking to transform their supply chains, that you have to get it right and work with the industries you need to produce the products you want to actually build a supply chain, and not rely on maybe so much the British Volts of this world.
Mm, absolutely, and I think it's really interesting as well that it's probably an area where government deserves a bit of credit. That they did ultimately recognise the importance of having these supply chains in place and closer to home. I mean, they made a lot of missteps along the way, but that JLR project that did get over the line because of proactive industrial policy and direct support from government. And I think the project to build the electric Mini in Oxford similarly. And I think there has been a recognition both from the government and from Labour that you do need to provide policy and subsidy support at the early stage of these industries, otherwise you're going to lose them.
Yeah.
And if you do lose them, you're in serious trouble, because it becomes it's a strategic and long-term competitiveness issue that we could just import all this technology, but there are huge risks and financial impacts that come with that. So there is a big case for keeping some parts of that supply chain here, and policymakers do seem to have bought that argument, albeit a little belatedly.
Okay, so in 2023, who do you nominate as your hero of the year?
I was thinking about this one, but I'm going to go for an individual actually. And whenever you go for an individual on these sort of things, you're slightly wary that this could all blow up in a few months' time. So this is not a kind of ringing endorsement of everything they ever do in the future. But I do think the story at Octopus Energy led by their CEO, Greg Jackson, is just one of the most remarkable British business success stories of modern times. That they recently secured an investment round that valued the company at £7.8 billion, which is, and it's 8 years old. And
Yeah.
we just haven't seen, sorry, $7.8 billion. Sorry, to get the currency right. But they raised about, I think it's about $800 million, latest investment round. They're now operating in, I can't remember the exact number, but multiple countries around the world. And the whole business is engineered towards advancing the net zero transition. It's clean energy, it's electric vehicles, it's smart grids. It's recognizing, as they've explained many times before, that the energy market globally was basically absolutely ripe for innovation. It had become, far too staid, was completely unfit for purpose. And they've come in and disrupted it. And it's still early days. There's lots of stories of companies trying to transform things that blow up at some point along the road. But to date, it has been a truly remarkable success. And I should say, probably shouldn't just pick him. I should also mention, the likes of OVO, and Ecotricity and Good Energy and some of the others that have similarly come in with this kind of pioneering model. So maybe it's Greg as a kind of representative of that
Yeah.
wave of companies. But I just think that's hugely, hugely exciting, and it's something we haven't seen British business do nearly enough of. With there's so many sort of interesting tech stories that come out of this country that they cash out a bit too early, or they don't have the kind of real global ambition that the Octopus and a couple of those others clearly do have. And it's been a remarkable year for them, and fingers crossed it will continue.
Excellent, good choice. Mine is also an organization, the UK Advertising Standards Agency, because their zero tolerance of greenwash, I think, is quite extraordinary, for a government quango who tend to be quite timid about how they interpret rules and things like that. Whereas they're looking at adverts for really quite big brands like Shell or Anglian Water and saying, well, you haven't put that claim in context. So, the famous one, the Shell advert with the lady showing the viewer around a service station with lots of electric charging points, and they banned that because it failed to mention that Shell makes the vast majority of its profits through fossil fuels. And likewise, Anglian Water came unstuck because they wanted to present their sustainable drainage system, but the ASA decided that as they'd had so many pollution incidents, that wasn't a valid thing to say. And that's quite I welcome it. It's just quite a fundamental appreciation of what greenwash means, and some of the things they've been saying about what they're going to do next year. It sounds like they're going to be continuing to ramp up that and really raise the bar on what people can claim as green.
Yeah, it's a fascinating one to watch, isn't it? I mean, what do you make of the sort of slight concern that there's a risk of going too far and forcing companies to kind of green hush, I suppose is the term that's used, or not promote things because they're too scared of getting slapped? Do you think that's a risk or not? I go back and forth on that.
I don't know. There's I think I'll show my age now. Greg Proops, when he was on Whose Line Is It Anyway, they were talking about the sort of have a nice day culture in the US compared to UK culture, and he said, I'd rather be told have a nice day by somebody who didn't mean it than sawed off by someone who did. And it's sort of like a bit like that to me, is that I'd almost rather people kept quiet about their green credentials but delivered,
Mm.
rather than presented green credentials when they're not delivering. So personally, I think that's a risk I'm willing to take. And well, during the summer, I did a off my own bat because I was hoping for some work for one of these corporations. But I looked at two big tech companies, neither of whom I'll name, and I looked at their sustainability reports ahead of a meeting, and they were chalk and cheese.
Mm.
A lot of one was just full of jargon and nice words, and all these quotes saying, "Oh, our carbon reduction is the equivalent of taking 15,000 cars off the road," and that sort of thing. But without saying, that could be 1% of their carbon footprint. It could be 30% of the carbon footprint, but they were never giving that context. Whereas the other brand were giving that context. Everything they were claiming was put firmly in context. And if it even forces people to live well, to look objectively at their own achievements and say whether that's any good or not. I think that's a win.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely, couldn't agree more.
Yeah. Okay, so next one we have is villain of the year. Uh, Plenty of candidates.
Indeed, as always. So I went back to the COP process again actually on this, and I've gone for the kind of how to term them, the kind of the axis of petrostates
Yeah,
who remain the big blockers of a more ambitious agreement on the international stage through the COP process. I think this year it was kind of Saudi Arabia who were the ones who took the hit, as they always tend to, and were the most kind of visible opponents of a more ambitious accord. But they are working in conjunction, and there is a group of nations, Russia and Iran and others would be amongst them, that are fiercely opposed to a more ambitious agreement on decarbonisation. And the thing that's particularly frustrating, I think, about some of those countries is they're not fiercely opposed to it on the kind of legitimate grounds that I think some developing countries have, in which they haven't been shown an alternative development path, or they haven't seen the funding they need to decarbonize. So, I think so when some of the kind of emerging petrostates from the global south say, look, we have a problem here, that 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 problem is legitimate. That needs addressing. There's much, I think, more legitimate concern there. But I think for some of the petrostates, and it's this small group that tend to be sort of leading the way on blocking a more ambitious agreement, it's unclear what they think beyond that. They're comfortable with a kind of 3-4 degree warming trajectory. They keep
yeah,
talking about carbon capture and storage as the potential solution and the role of fossil fuels in the transition, but you're not seeing them deploy carbon capture and storage at any different really realistic scale. And I think I'm always a bit reluctant to point fingers at villains in this thing. I think it's much more complicated. I think they would rightly say that the global north is consuming the oil that they produce, and the demand side has to be
mhm.
tackled. But I think that argument falls down when you see stories such as we saw at COP28 of Saudi officials going into emerging economies and trying to lock in future fossil fuel demand.
Yeah.
That
So,
when they're actually trying to manipulate and drive demand, as well as continuing to drive supply, you have to look at it and say, look, you are not seriously committed to the things you've said you're committed to. And I think they remain one of the biggest challenges we face in driving forward global decarbonisation.
yes, it's that the old cliche about it's very difficult to make somebody understand something if their livelihood depends on them not understanding it. You mentioned before about how the economic development of many of these states is built entirely on fossil fuels. So it's quite a fundamental ask we're making of them. All of society is modern society is built on fossil fuels, but I think for some of us it's going to be easier to transform away from it. But of course, if the rest of the world does decarbonize, then those states won't find their economies booming anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know, I mean, also that it does all play into the wider sort of insecurity that we're seeing. I mean, that you can't deny that some of these states are involved in conflicts that they themselves triggered, um, and that is just destabilizing everything. And there just doesn't seem to be an interest from them in um, building a more sort of secure, stable economic and geopolitical model. And I think that's just deeply, deeply worrying as we go into this year when some of these conflicts could explode and
Mhm.
expand still further. So it's worrying times to say the least. And I think they're deserving villains.
Yes, I should probably have gone for the same, but I went for somebody who irritated me intensely this year. And we talked before about UK politics and how the ruling Conservative Party is, or has been at least flirting with trying to use net zero and various things as wedge issues on the run up to what's going to be a very difficult election for them. And, we had Rishi Sunak and his 7 bins and whatnot. But I'd like to single out Mark Harper UK Transport Secretary for describing 15-minute neighbourhoods as, and I quote, sinister. Uh, just in case anybody doesn't know, a 15-minute neighborhood is just a planning concept where everybody's got all the amenities they need on their doorstep rather than having to crisscross the city to go to the doctors or go shopping, whatever else. It's just about having it nice and convenient, so you don't have to drive as much, so you get to speak to your neighbors more. And it's not even that new. About 20 years ago, it used to be called the urban village. But conspiracy theorists have latched onto this, and they claim it means we will be banned from traveling more than 15 minutes from our houses, which is all linked into the sort of COVID thing. And it's full on tinfoil hat stuff. Nobody's ever proposed this. And that was what Mark Harper was sort of tapping into, that sort of paranoid conspiracy theory side. And, as a government minister, and particularly a government minister for transport, to be flirting with off the scale conspiracy theories, I think is something else. So I'm singling him out, but it's really, I suppose, anybody in a position of power who, uh, flirts with idiocy on this scale. Uh, so it is quite domestic, and it is just a personal thing because I love the concept of a 15-minute city. But yes, I'm afraid Mark Harper gets my thumbs down for the year.
I don't know. I'd happily agree with that one. And actually, that whole conference, that party conference in September, I mean, I think Claire Coutinho also questioned or tried to allege that Keir Starmer was pursuing a meat tax, which is just, it is post-truth politics. And however they try and position it as a bit of knockabout fun, it is degrading. It sort of undermines confidence in politics. And these are serious issues. And I think that was a real low point for a party that is obviously struggling to build an approach that can get it back in favour with the public.
So, if that's 2023 taken care of, what are we going to see in 2024? What are your three most important things coming over the horizon, James?
So I wrote a piece earlier was it last week actually, on called the unpredictions for the green economy in 2024. I think the first thing to say is it's just really, really difficult to work out what is going to happen. There's just so much volatility based primarily on the conflicts that are happening and the impacts those could have on global supply chains and security in key regions. But then beyond that, of course, as many people have commented, I think it's something like 2 billion people are going to be invited to vote this year. I think like over 60 of the world's democracies are staging elections. So there's just this inherent baked in uncertainty. But obviously, I mean, two of mine just relate directly to that. I think the US election could be transformational and could be deeply, deeply worrying for the entire green agenda. I think everyone always tries to put a gloss on it and say, look, the US states will remain committed to decarbonisation, even if you have a President Trump. And last time he took the US out of the Paris Agreement, and the Paris Agreement stayed strong and other countries didn't follow him. And that's all true, but I just think the damage that could be done is off the charts and deeply, deeply worrying. So I think the US election is obviously almost the top of the list. And then we've already mentioned it a couple of times domestically, the UK election as well, which I think we can be more positive about. I think the polls suggest it will see a positive shift in green policy development. I think you'd have if Labour do win, you'd have a government coming in that, regardless of the fiscal constraints, would treat decarbonisation as more of a top priority, would look to push through planning reforms that would have a big positive impact on clean energy development, and would improve the mood music around this stuff, would send fewer conflicting signals. But then also I think that's slightly caveated by the fact that would be all the good stuff. But the flip side of it is I think we are going to see the politicisation of climate policy more than we ever have done before. And if the Tories were to lose, again, I wouldn't call it at this stage. It's still a bit too early to call it. But, if the polls are correct and the Tories were to lose, the two most likely replacements for Rishi Sunak would be Kemi Badenoch and Suella Braverman, both of whom in the last leadership election said they would either scrap or water down the UK's net zero targets. So, I think the outlook in the UK is considerably better than the US potentially on this stuff. But equally, I think we are going to see that same polarization on these issues. And it's possible to get a bit too obsessed about politics. I know lots of business people say, look, we're leading the way, we're doing more, but it just doesn't help. It makes
Yeah.
everyone's life harder if the political mood music and the policies are chopping and changing, that should be helping to accelerate this transition rather than slow it down. So those are two of them. Sorry, I did two at
Yeah.
once, but they are
No,
kind
that's
of
all
very
right.
much interrelated.
You won't be surprised to know that I've got the same, but particularly the US. And yeah, I'd heard 2 million people, 2 billion people are voting. Somebody said 4 billion. It seems to go up every time it was reported on the press. Uh, but I was wondering, okay, if Trump stays out of jail and gets back into the White House, will he do the same thing that he did uh, to Barack Obama's legacy last time, try and destroy as much of it as he can just out of spite? But on the other hand, the Inflation Reduction Act does seem to be working in the US, and the economy is growing much stronger than most of the rest of the world. So will he cancel that if it's working? I suppose that's the question I have in my head.
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if it'd have the capacity to necessarily cancel it or repeal it as such. I think the bigger threat would be that he would just turbocharge new oil and gas licensing straight from the off. So he would almost immediately try and lock in yet another wave of fossil fuel infrastructure that if it got built would be hard to unpick. And then obviously you have the international aspect of if he did remove from the Paris Agreement, particularly at a time when this time around the geopolitical tensions between, as I mentioned before, some of those petrostates and the rest are more pronounced than they were. Would he this time be able to trigger a bit of an exodus from the Paris Agreement and get some
Mhm.
kind of authoritarian allies alongside him? So I think there's huge potential risks there, not to mention the risks of conflict and economic disruption that would flow from him taking a kind of isolationist
Yeah.
perspective on Ukraine and other areas. So yeah, I think I get the argument that there's things he wouldn't be able to unpick, but God, it's scary stuff, isn't it?
Yes. And that's going on to more scary stuff. You mentioned Ukraine there, but we've got turmoil obviously continuing in Ukraine and the Middle East itself. And, with the Venezuela saber rattling in South America over oil reserves, I think that's going to keep oil prices high through the year, which in turn, the only silver lining of it is it will favor renewables on both cost and energy security grounds. So we, whether or not we have politicians in the rest of the world actually properly grasping the nettle to exploit that, or whether it just happens organically on economic grounds, I think renewables will continue to surge because of the turmoil in oil producing areas.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with that. I think the transition is underway, isn't it? And I just think that it's not going to go backwards. It's all just about the pace and how many barriers are put in its way. But the broad economic thrust of it is locked in now, and
Mm.
yeah, long may that continue.
Well, I think you flagged up your third one already.
Oh, I'd
We're
mentioned
talking about
CBAM. Yeah,
CBAM.
I
Yeah.
had CBAM as one of them. Although actually related to it, I suppose, is the wider um, Bridgetown agenda. Um, this sort of package of financial reforms that are being proposed by Barbados Prime Minister Mia Mottley. I was lucky enough to see her speak at COP 29, sorry, COP 28, and she was hugely impressive. And I think her central argument that international financial institutions need reforming to mobilize and enable more climate finance into developing economies is just kind of unanswerable. And there's an increasingly large coalition around that plan. I think it was notable at the start of the year, Emmanuel Macron kind of again highlighted his support for really quite significant reform to boost flows of climate finance into developing economies and deliver, I think, what he called like a green interest rate that would lower interest rates for green projects, again, particularly in emerging and developing economies.
Mm.
And it feels like it's absolutely an idea whose time has come. Honestly, it should have come 10 years ago, but I think there is going to be quite a lot of momentum around it this year, partly because COP28 kind of got that commitment on fossil fuels that it wanted. This year's COP, the question will be, well, what's it about? Because it's not until next year that we're going to get the next wave of national climate action plans submitted. So there is a little bit of a gap in kind of like what should it be about? And I think climate finance will be right at the top of that agenda.
Mm-hmm.
And will likely be the defining issue from this year's COP. And I think there is a bit of an opportunity amidst all the turmoil for, governments to come together and say, right, well, there are, relatively simple changes we can make to the way the World Bank, the way the IMF operates, the way a lot of the big donor countries provide finance, that really could have a transformational impact. And it's not a quick fix, but I think there'll be hopefully be some interesting developments on that. And of course, CBAM absolutely plays into that. And this idea of international carbon taxation that we're seeing with the UN CORSIA mechanism, offsetting mechanism for aviation, that plays into that as well. So I think the hope is, if we've got some optimistic glasses at a rather pessimistic time, is that we are seeing some really interesting thinking on all those fronts, and just maybe we could see some encouraging progress this year to get some those kind of interlocking reforms coming forward that would have a really substantial real world impact on clean energy and climate development right around the world.
Excellent. And that bridge, what was the Bridgeton?
The Bridgetown Agenda, it's called, named after Bridgetown, where it was kind of developed. I mean, it's
Right.
kind of a bit of an umbrella term for lots of quite technical reforms around how the IMF and the World Bank lend money, how they leverage in private capital, whether or not we can start to see, and Mia Motley made this point, that we need other forms of international, potentially taxation, if we are to get up above, to the sort of 400 billion plus levels of climate finance we need to see flowing into these emerging and developing economies. So it's really important, if slightly technocratic stuff.
Yeah, well, it's something I'm certainly going to have to go and Google after this session because I wasn't so familiar with it, which is why I invited you along, because you know about these things. My third one, well, actually looking at it now, is a little bit wiffle-waffly, and I talked about it before, which is I think there's going to be a reckoning between those corporations who are truly embracing sustainability and those who are, they may think they are, but it's business as usual with a bit of greenwash thrown on top. And I think that gap is going to become increasingly apparent as we move into these economic and policy agendas that we're talking about before. I think a lot of people are going to have to go back and say, yes, we have a net zero target. We've promised we'll do this. We'll promise that. What are we actually doing to deliver on that, rather than sort of a little bit of energy efficiency or some solar panels on the factory roof or whatever it might be. And I talked about the Advertising Standards Agency before. I think they're going to have their work cut out for them, because I think they're going to be, a lot of these claims do need knocking down. And as I said before, if that ends up in green hush, I'm happy with that, as long as those companies are delivering.
Yeah, no, I think it's almost one of the defining issues, isn't it, for corporates at the moment, is like how serious they are about this agenda. I always say to when people sort of ask me about it, like when you're assessing it as a journalist, it often just comes back to the money. It's like if you've got an announcement that's actually backed by investment that says we are going to invest this amount in delivering on these goals, it just immediately becomes so much more plausible than these just vague aspirational targets. I think you need to explain the how as well as the what and why you're trying to do. And I think so many of these announcements just don't necessarily have that real financial backing that they need. And the best ones absolutely do. I mean, more and more we're writing stories about corporates that kind of have multi-million or multi-billion dollar funds already assigned over the coming decade, to say that, when they talk about decarbonising their factories, there is a plan. There is a plan to actually do it. It isn't just, oh, this is something we're going to do, hopefully, at some point in the near future.
Yeah, and what I came across only really towards the end of last year, thinking back to last year, was that a lot of people now are having been stung maybe by the accusation that net zero is intrinsically greenwashing, which I don't agree with, but it could be used as cover. They're actually underpinning their zero target with science-based targets for decarbonisation underneath. So they can actually be held to account or hold themselves to account against a defined carbon reduction trajectory rather than just, oh, in 2040, we will be carbon neutral.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. The final question that I posed us both was if I ruled the world, so wishful thinking, but within reasonably economically and thermodynamically valid actions.
Um, yeah, this is a tricky one. I often ask this one as well of people, like, what's the one thing you'd do? And of course, it's a bit of a trick question, isn't it? Because the kind of the wicked nature of climate change and environmental problems is there isn't one thing. There's just not a simple fix to any of it. But I suppose if you're looking for like the biggest impact, I think touching on that CBAM issue that we were talking about earlier, I mean, any classical economist would tell you we've got to price the externality.
Yeah.
And if you could find a way to get a carbon price onto pollution, onto emissions, and then redistribute the funds that you raise in a sort of tax and dividend model to, benefit those who are disproportionately impacted by that tax, that's the thing that I think would have a real transformative impact. And I don't think it's a coincidence that since the EU has had a deeply imperfect but still some form of carbon pricing in place, it's kind of led the world on decarbonisation efforts whilst at the same time not seeing a negative impact on its living standards. I think there's a kind of that's probably the one thing you'd do from a kind of dry, boring thing. I think the other thing I'd do, just if I was to have a second one, is
Go
is,
ahead.
is to put and lots of people would disagree with this, but I think a lot more money into carbon removals. I
Yeah.
think at the point in the crisis that we're at, and the level of really exciting stuff that's going on in carbon removals, I think a lot more funding and focus on that sector,
Yeah.
and also more governance on that sector, because let's not pretend there are significant risks to some of the carbon removal projects. So just a bigger focus in general, both in terms of governance and financing for those emerging carbon removal technologies and projects.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's things like carbon capture storage. Again, there's a sort of perfectionist wing of environmentalism which sort of wants to intrinsically knock them down. If somebody could come up with a truly sustainable aviation fuel, I would be delighted, but you get the impression that some people would actually be slightly disappointed. Uh,
Yeah,
and the same with carbon capture and storage. If it can be made to work at scale economically, it would be fantastic. The hydrogen economy is another one on that list, which I can see the real benefits of it, and I wish it would work, but a little bit of cynicism because nobody's really got hydrogen delivering at scale yet, despite decades of trying. So yeah, it's on that list of things that I would like to happen, but
mm.
I'm not holding out too much hope.
But also they're all things that kind of need to happen. So there just needs to be more focus on them. Again, this
Yeah,
this is the frustration I have with the oil and gas majors saying, well, it's we're committed to decarbonisation. And it's like, well, you're the people with the expertise and the deep pockets that could start to make some of these things happen at scale, and yet you are often lobbying against them and not investing nearly enough in them. So I think I think it's an area where there's real flaws on all sides of the environmental movement, both from kind of the deep greens who knee-jerk oppose it, and then from, I suppose, the more pragmatist wing where we're just not seeing the progress on
yeah,
it. So it's all deeply frustrating, but it does remain very hard to see how you get to net zero emissions in a modern industrialized economy,
yeah,
um, without that suite of solutions. Not as the main solution. I think renewables, electrification, that will continue to dominate, but to deal with the last sort of 20% of emissions, you are going to need breakthroughs in these areas.
yeah.
And they're not getting enough R&D, they're not getting enough policy development, and they're certainly not getting enough deployment.
Well, if I ruled the world was to abolish fossil fuel subsidies, which in a way effectively might mean some carbon pricing as well. But just almost every budget we've had in the UK for as long as I can remember has always had some tax break for North Sea oil and gas exploration. You think, well, that's the dominant economic model. Why can't it, clean its own face in terms of exploration? Why does the taxpayer have to keep subsidizing it? Uh, so but other, I suppose, subsidies for perverse incentives, et cetera, try and eliminate those because we've seen renewable energy uh, plummet in cost. We've seen technologies such as heat pumps start to reduce in cost. I wouldn't say plummet just yet, but if we could take away some of the subsidies that promote high carbon behavior, high carbon infrastructure, I think that would get us much further down the road much more quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just still utterly perverse that there's such huge subsidies being provided to them.
Yeah.
And yeah, just ridiculous way to run an economy that's trying to decarbonize. I mean, I get that it's politically difficult, but there's got to be more progress from governments
Yeah.
all around the world on tackling that level of support that's handed to this industry.
Right. Well, I think we've put the world to rights then.
Indeed, everything's fixed for
Yes.
2024. So,
We've set out how to do this. So it just leaves me to thank you very much, James, for taking part. And I hope everybody got a huge amount of insight out of that session.
yeah, thanks for having me. Much appreciated.